All right, we are now live for another of the Storytime with Sadler. I'm going to read for you some of my favorite short stories. These are very short stories indeed, this time by H.P. Lovecraft. I wanted to do The Cats of Ulthar because it is actually one of my favorite stories by Lovecraft. And it also has to do with, I think many of you know, I care about cats quite a bit. But I saw how short it was, and I thought, well, maybe we need to do a double header of sorts. So we also have The Other Gods, which is set in the same narrative universe. We're not going to do the unknown Cadith, dream stuff because that's a much longer story. So what I do in all these sessions is I read the story and I tell you about what it is that I particularly like about it, how I got into it, and then we do some Q&A, some comments. We have some conversation here. You can leave whatever you would like to in the chat. And usually we wind up spending a good bit of time in these sessions. So with no further ado, let's start with H.P. Lovecraft's The Cats of Ulthar. It is said that in Ulthar, which lies beyond the river Sky, no man may kill a cat. And this I can verily believe as I gaze upon him who sitteth purring before the fire. For the cat is cryptic and close to strange things which men cannot see. He is the soul of antique Egyptus and bearer of tales from forgotten cities in Meroe and Ophir. He is the kin of the jungle's lords and heir to the secrets of hoary and sinister Africa. The Sphinx is his cousin, and he speaks her language, but he is more ancient than the Sphinx and remembers that which she hath forgotten. In Ulthar, before ever the burgesses forbade the killing of cats, there dwelt an old cotter and his wife who delighted to trap and slay the cats of their neighbors. Why they did this, I know not, save that many hate the voice of the cat in the night, and take it ill that cats should run stealthily about yards and gardens at twilight. But whatever the reason, this old man and woman took pleasure in trapping and slaying every cat which came near to their hovel. And from some of the sounds heard after dark, many villagers fancied that the manner of slaying was exceedingly peculiar. But the villagers did not discuss such things with the old man and his wife because of the habitual expression on the withered faces of the two, and because their cottage was so small and so darkly hidden under spreading oaks at the back of a neglected yard. In truth, much as the owners of cats hated these odd folk, they feared them even more. And instead of berating them as brutal assassins, merely took care that no cherished pet or mouser should stray toward the remote hovel under the dark trees. When through some unavoidable oversight a cat was missed and sounds heard after dark, the loser would lament impotently, or console himself by thanking fate it was not one of his children who had thus vanished. For the people of Ulthar were simple, and knew not whence it is all cats first came. One day, a caravan of strange wanderers from the south entered the narrow cobbled streets of Ulthar. Dark wanderers they were, and unlike the other roving folk who passed through the village twice every year. In the marketplace, they told fortunes for silver and bought gay beads from the merchants. What was the land of these wanderers? None could tell. But it was seen that they were given to strange prayers, and that they had painted on the sides of their wagons strange figures with human bodies and the heads of cats, hawks, rams, and lions. And the leader of the caravan wore a headdress with two horns and a curious disc betwixt the horns. There was in this singular caravan a little boy with no father or mother, but only a tiny black kitten to cherish. The plague had not been kind to him, yet had left him this small furry thing to mitigate his sorrow. And when one is very young, one can find great relief in the lively antics of a black kitten. So the boy who the dark people called Menes smiled more often than he wept as he sat playing with his graceful kitten on the steps of an oddly painted wagon. On the third morning of the wanderer's stay in Ulthar, Menes could not find his kitten. And as he sobbed aloud in the marketplace, certain villagers told him of the old man and his wife and of sounds heard in the night. And when he heard these things, his sobbing gave place to meditation and finally to prayer. He stretched his arms towards the sun and prayed in a tongue no villager could understand. Though indeed the villagers did not try very hard to understand, since their attention was mostly taken up by the sky and the odd shapes the clouds were assuming. It was very peculiar. But as the little boy uttered his petition, there seemed to form overhead the shadowy, nebulous figures of exotic things, of hybrid creatures crowned with horn flanked discs. Nature is full of such illusions to impress the imaginative. That night, the wanderers left Ulthar and were never seen again, and the householders were troubled when they noticed that in all the village there was not a cat to be found. From each hearth, the familiar cat had vanished. Cats large and small, black, gray, striped, yellow, and white. Old Crannon, the burgomaster, swore that the dark folk had taken the cats away in revenge for the killing of Menes's kitten and cursed the caravan and the little boy. But Nith, the lean notary, declared that the old cotter and his wife were more likely persons to suspect, for their hatred of cats was notorious and increasingly bold. Still, no one durst complain to the sinister couple, even when little Atul, the innkeeper's son, vowed that he had at mid twilight seen all the cats of Ulthar in that accursed yard under the trees, pacing very slowly and solemnly in a circle around the cottage, two abreast, as if in performance of some rite, unheard of rite of beasts. The villagers did not know how much to believe from so small a boy, and though they feared that the evil pair had charmed the cats to their death, they preferred not to chide the old cotter until they had met him outside his dark and repellent yard. So Althar went to sleep in vain anger, and when the people awaked at dawn, behold, every cat was back at his accustomed hearth, large and small, black, gray, striped, yellow, and white. None was missing. Very sleek and fat did the cats appear, and sonorous with purring content. The citizens talked with one another of the affair and marveled not a little. Old Crannon again insisted it was the dark folk who had taken them, since cats did not return alive from the cottage of the ancient man and his wife. But all agreed on one thing, that the refusal of all the cats to eat their portions of meat or drink their saucers of milk was exceedingly curious. And for 2 whole days, the sleek, lazy cats of Ulthar would touch no food, but only doze by the fire or in the sun. It was fully a week before the villagers noticed that no lights were appearing at dusk in the windows of the cottage under the trees. Then the lean Nith remarked that no one had seen the old man or his wife since the night the cats were away. In another week, the burgomaster decided to overcome his fears and call at the strangely silent dwelling as a matter of duty. Though in doing so, he was careful to take with him Shang, the blacksmith, and Thule, the cutter of stone, as witnesses. And when they'd broken down the frail door, they found only this: two cleanly picked human skeletons on the earthen floor, and a number of singular beetles crawling in the shadowy corners. There was subsequently much talk among the burgesses of Ulthar. Zath, the coroner, disputed at length with Nilth, the lean notary, and Crannon and Shang and Thule were overwhelmed with questions. Even little Atul, the innkeeper's son, was closely questioned and given a sweetmeat as a reward. They talked of the old cotter and his wife, of the caravan of dark wanderers, of small Menes and his black kitten, of the prayer of Menes and of the sky during that prayer, of the doings of the cat on the night the caravan left, and of what was later found in the cottage under the dark trees in the repellent yard. And in the end, the burgesses passed that remarkable law, which is told of by traders in Hotheg and discussed by travelers in Near, namely, that in Ulthar no man may kill a cat. So that is the very short story, The Cats of Ulthar by H.P. Lovecraft. Let's turn now, since we're doing a double header, to the next story set in the same narrative universe, The Other Gods. So, The Other Gods by H.P. Lovecraft. Atop the tallest of earth's peaks dwell the gods of earth, and suffer no man to tell that he hath looked upon them. Lesser peaks they once inhabited, but ever the men from the plains would scale the slopes of rock and snow, driving the gods to higher and higher mountains, till now only the last remains. When they left their older peaks, they took with them all signs of themselves, save once, it is said, when they left a carven image in the face of the mountain which they called Negrangtek. But now they have betaken themselves to unknown Kadath in the cold waste where no man treads, and are grown stern, having no higher peak whereto to flee at the coming of men. They are grown stern, and where once they suffered men to displace them, they now forbid men to come, or coming to depart. It is well for men that they know not of Kadath in the cold waste, else they would seek injudiciously to scale it. Sometimes when earth's gods are homesick, they visit in the still night the peaks where once they dwelt, and weep softly as they try to play in the olden way on remembered slopes. Men have felt the tears of the gods on white-capped Thurai, though they have thought it rain, and have heard the sighs of the gods in the plaintive dawn winds of Larian. In cloud ships, the gods are wont to travel, and wise cotters have legends that keep them from certain high peaks at night when it is cloudy, for the gods are not as lenient as of old. In Ulthar, which lies beyond the river Sky, once dwelt an old man avid to behold the gods of earth, a man deeply learned in the 7 cryptical books of Hassan and familiar with the Pentateuch manuscripts of distant and frozen Lomar. His name was Barzai the Wise, and the villagers tell of how he went up a mountain on the night of the strange eclipse. Barzai knew so much of the gods that he could tell of their comings and goings, and guessed so many of their secrets that he was deemed half a god himself. It was he who wisely advised the burgesses of Ulthar when they passed their remarkable law against the slaying of cats, and who first told the young priest Atel where it is that black cats go at midnight on St. John's Eve. Barzai was learned in the lore of Earth's gods, and had gained a desire to look upon their faces. He believed that his great secret knowledge of gods could shield him from their wrath. So resolved to go up to the summit of high and rocky Hagath Kla on a night when he knew the gods would be there. Hagath Kla is far in the stony desert beyond Hotheg, for which it is named, and rises like a rock statue in a silent temple. Around its peak, the mists play always mournfully, for mists are the memories of the gods, and the gods loved Hagath Kla when they dwelt upon it in the old days. Often the gods of earth visit Hagath Kla in the ships of cloud, casting pale vapors over the slopes as they dance reminiscently on the summit under a clear moon. The villagers of Hotheg say it is ill to climb Hagath Kla at any time, and deadly to climb it by night when pale vapors hide the summit and the moon. But Barzai heeded them not when he came from neighboring Ulthar with the young priest Atel, who was his disciple. Atel was only the son of an innkeeper and was sometimes afraid. But Barzai's father had been a landgrave who dwelt in an ancient castle, so he had no common superstition in his blood, and only laughed at the fearful cotters. Barzai and Atel went out of Hotheg into the stony desert despite the prayers of peasants, and talked of Earth's gods by their campfires at night. Many days they traveled, and from afar saw lofty Hotheg Kla with his aureole of mournful mist. On the 13th day, They reached the mountain's lonely base, and Atul spoke of his fears. But Barzai was old and learned and had no fears, and so led the way boldly up the slope that no man had scaled since the time of Sansu, who is written of with fright in the moldy Panoptic manuscripts. The way was rocky and made perilous by chasms, cliffs, and falling stones. Later, it grew cold and snowy, and Barzai and Atul often slipped and fell as they hewed and plodded upward with staves and axes. Finally, the air grew thin, and the sky changed color, and the climbers found it hard to breathe. But still, they toiled up and up, marveling at the strangeness of the scene and uh, thrilling at the thought of what would happen on the summit when the moon was out and the pale vapors spread around. For 3 days, they climbed higher towards the roof of the world. Then they camped to wait for the clouding of the moon. For 4 nights, no clouds came, and the moon shone down cold through the thin, mournful mists around the silent pinnacle. Then on the 5th night, which was the night of the full moon, Barzai saw some dense clouds far to the north and stayed up with Atul to watch them draw near. Thick and majestic, they sailed slowly and deliberately onward, ranging themselves round the peak high above the watchers and hiding the moon and the summit from view. For a long hour, the watchers gazed while the vapors swirled and the screen of clouds grew thicker and more restless. Barzai was wise in the lore of Earth's gods and listened hard for certain sounds. But Atul felt the chill of the vapors and the awe of the night and feared much. And when Barzai began to climb higher and beckon eagerly, it was long before Atul would follow. So thick were the vapors that the way was hard, and though Atul followed on at last, he could scarce see the gray shape of Barzai on the dim slope above in the clouded moonlight. Barzai forged very far ahead and seemed, despite his age, to climb more easily than Atul, fearing not the steepness that began to grow too great for any save a strong and dauntless man, nor pausing at wide black chasms that Atul scarce could leap. And so they went up wildly over rocks and gulfs, slipping and stumbling, and sometimes awed at the vastness and horrible silence of bleak ice pinnacles and mute granite steps. Very suddenly, Barzai went out of Atul's sight, scaling a hideous cliff that seemed to bulge outward and block the path for any climber not inspired of Earth's gods. Atul was far below and planning what he should do when he reached the place, when curiously he noticed that the light had grown strong, as if the cloudless peak and moonlit meeting place of the gods were very near. And as he scrambled on towards the bulging cliff and litten sky, he felt fears more shocking than any he had known before. Then through the high mists, he heard the voice of unseen Barzai, shouting wildly in delight, "I have heard the gods. I have heard Earth's gods singing in reveille on Hagath Kla. The voices of Earth's gods are known to Barzai the prophets. The mists are thin and the moon is bright, and I shall see the gods dancing wildly on Hagath Kla that they loved in youth. The wisdom of Barzai hath made him greater than Earth's gods, and against his will their spells and barriers are as naught. Barzai will behold the gods, the proud gods, the secret gods, the gods of Earth who spurn the sight of man." Atul could not hear the voices Barzai heard, but he was now close to the bulging cliff and scanning it for footholds. Then he heard Barzai's voice grow shriller and louder. "The mists are very thin and the moon casts shadows on the slope. The voices of Earth's gods are high and wild, and they fear the coming of Barzai the Wise, who is greater than they. The moon's lights flickers as Earth's gods dance against it. I shall see the dancing forms of the gods that leap and howl in the moonlight. The light is dimmer and the gods are afraid." Whilst Barzai was shouting these things, Atul felt a spectral change in the air, as if the laws of Earth were bowing to greater laws. For though the way was steeper than ever, the upward path was now grown fearsomely easy, and the bulging cliff proved scarce an obstacle when he reached it and slid perilously up its convex face. The light of the moon had strangely failed, and as Atal plunged upward through the mists, he heard Barzai the Wise shrieking in the shadows. The moon is dark and the gods dance in the night. There is terror in the sky, for upon the moon hath sunk an eclipse foretold in no books of men or of earth's gods. There is unknown magic on Hagath Kla, for the screams of the frightened gods have turned to laughter. And the slopes of ice shoot up endlessly into the black heavens, whither I am plunging. Hey, hey, at last, in the dim light, I behold the gods of earth. And now, Atal, slipping dizzily up over inconceivable steeps, heard in the dark a loathsome laughing, mixed with such a cry as no man else ever heard, save in the phlegethon of unrelatable nightmares, a cry wherein reverberated the horror and anguish of a haunted lifetime packed into one atrocious moment. The other gods, the other gods, the gods of the outer hells that guard the feeble gods of earth. Look away, go back, do not see, do not see. The vengeance of the infinite abysses, that cursed, that damnable pit. Merciful gods of earth, I am falling into the sky. And as Atal shut his eyes and stopped his ears and tried to jump downward against the frightful pull from unknown heights, there resounded on Hagath Kla that terrible peal of thunder which awakened the good cotters of the plains and the honest burgesses of Hatheg and Near and Ulthar, and caused them to behold through the clouds that strange eclipse of the moon that no book ever predicted. And when the moon came out at last, Atal was safe on the lower snows of the mountain, without sight of Earth's gods or of the other gods. Now it is told in the moldy Panoptic manuscripts that Sansu found naught but wordless ice and rock when he climbed Hagath Kla in the youth of the world. Yet, when the men of Ulthar and Near and Hatheg crushed their fears and scaled that haunted steep by day in search of Barzai the Wise, they found graven in the naked stone of the summit a curious and cyclopean symbol 50 cubits wide, as if the rock had been riven by some titanic chisel. And the symbol was like to one that learned men have discerned in those frightful parts of the Panoptic manuscripts, which are too ancient to be read. This they found. Barzai the Wise they never found, nor could the holy priest Atal ever be persuaded to pray for his soul's repose. Moreover, to this day, the people of Ulthar and Near and Hatheg fear eclipses and pray by night when pale vapors hide the mountaintop and the moon. And above the mists on Hagath Kla, Earth's gods sometimes dance reminiscently, for they know they are safe and love to come from unknown Kadath in ships of cloud and play in the olden way, as they did when Earth was new and men not given to the climbing of inaccessible places. So there we have two quite short stories by H.P. Lovecraft, and these are not part of his, let's call it, cosmic horror tales that people know as the Cthulhu mythos, and I think he's most famous for. This is from an earlier period where he was under the influence of Dunsanian and was writing things that were more fantastical, right? I think you could say that there is horror involved in these, but they're more fantasy stories. The first is almost a fairy tale, isn't it, about the cats. This one is a twist story about human beings that are going to, one, all too hubristically, the other one reluctantly following along, going to see something that they're not supposed to see because they are bold and have the power to contravene the will of the gods. But then they find out there are other gods, gods more powerful, gods perhaps more ancient, gods who protect the earth's gods. So I've always loved these two stories myself. I read them, I think I want to say as a middle schooler, probably in sixth or seventh grade, not in anything that I was assigned, but because I checked out a book from the library of H.P. Lovecraft's short stories. And I'm not sure what put into my head to check them out. But I really did enjoy reading them. And I'll say one other thing before I look at some of the questions and comments. It was a very nice surprise to me to find out with both of my kids, because I never really try to push them, oh, you should read this, you should read this. I let them come to things on their own, that both of them on their own independently came to start reading and be interested in the stories of H.P. Lovecraft. So, all right. So, who framed the Socratic method says, I think he returns. Well, Atal certainly returns. Quinn wanted to say thanks for your content on the master servant dialectic. Yeah, that's good. That's Hegel, not really connected to Lovecraft. Um, so to this Dunsany fantasy in Cadath. Yeah. Oh, you mean H.P. Lovecraft returns to this, not that Barzai returns, because Barzai is gone. You're not getting him back any more than you're getting the little black kitten back. Yeah, he has the Dream Waste of Unknown Cadath, which is a much longer story, and they're all set within the same narrative universe. As I mean, you can tell very, very easily by the characters that are being mentioned here, by the events that are crisscrossing, by the locations and stuff like that. So I'd be curious to see what other people make of these stories. If you've read them before, it's kind of a departure for Lovecraft. These are among some of my favorite stories. This idea of the sky opening up, and as he puts it, the laws changing. Let me get back to that passage. Um, and then, going up into the sky, right? That is, here we go. As if the laws of earth were bowing to greater laws, not just alternate laws, but greater laws. There's a revelation here of how things truly are. And this is Lovecraftian, right? Lovecraft has this remark that he makes about if we really knew how things stood, and I'm paraphrasing here, we would be just terrified, witnessing how things really are. And he's got another story. I don't remember the name of it offhand, where somebody invents a machine that will let you see all the beings around you. And, if we're like big boosters of science, we'd be like, oh, that's amazing. We can see much further than we did before. And for Lovecraft, it drives the person, the scientist, insane with terror because he sees all of these creeping, crawling, not fitting neatly into our Euclidean geometry universe things that are all around us. And it's interesting if you think about that thematic. Um, think about how it must have been for people to realize that bacteria are everywhere, gross germs, uh, for us, we kind of were like, yeah, okay, we know that from biology class, but earlier generations had to adjust to that. Or think about the shock involved in realizing that the earth not only is not the center of the solar system, but it is just a tiny little blip in the universe itself. That's one of the key, I don't want to say ideas, feelings is a better term, that Lovecraft himself is very much responding to and influenced by. Quinn says about the master slave dialectic, I meant it saved me with an assignment recently. Definitely love the fantasy thriller. Okay, that's a good one. Yeah, fantasy thriller, not fantasy horror, fantasy thriller with a twist to each one, right? Aspects of these. And, does that twist technique work as well in the present where we're kind of accustomed to it. I think, for me, it still does, but it doesn't work with every author. I mean, if you've read O. Henry, you know that he's another American author, loves to always have like a twist at the end. Guy de Maupassant, a French author, is like that as well. And sometimes it seems a little contrived or a little bit trite. In these stories, and perhaps that's because of the structure of the stories, or perhaps it's just because Lovecraft is a great writer at times. It really works, and I think it works better in the other gods than it does in the Cats of Ulthar, in part because we're working with changing the very structure of reality, the universe that we're in. Quinn says, kind of reminded me of Poe. Yeah, it's interesting you bring that up. Lovecraft is a big fan of Poe, and Stephen King at one point, and I don't remember where he says this. He says we had Poe, and Poe begets Lovecraft, and I, Stephen King, am influenced by Lovecraft and by Poe, tracing out a kind of genealogy of imaginative horror, because we can talk about unimaginative horror. We can talk about things that, I was talking about this with my students because we read Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and when you look at the depictions of Frankenstein, the Frankenstein's monster as this stupid brute that just goes around afraid of fire, right? Um, it can be comedy fodder for Scooby Doo or Abbott and Costello, but it's not really getting at you anymore. When you read Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and you think about the important philosophical questions that are being raised in the interactions between the creature and Frankenstein himself, and you've got a very intelligent creature, who's read Milton and Plutarch and other people, Sorrows of Young Werther, right? There you've got the potential for something greater, something richer. And I think that's part of what you can say with that genealogy. Stephen King, um, especially in his earlier writings, is quite a great horror author, and is influenced by Lovecraft, who is influenced by Poe. So yeah, I think there is a poetic influence going on there. Any other things that you want to say, ask about when it comes to these stories? I mean, for me, the saddest part is poor Menace, right? I mean, the kid does get revenge, but he loses you know, this little kitten that is his one consolation, his one friend in the world. And that's what's needed to get the plot going, right? And it doesn't make things better for Menace that he attains revenge. All right, so who framed the Socratic method? Do you think the revelation of terror is informed by his science, journalism, and worldview? For me, it's a comment on tragedy device like Deus Ex Machina, or limits of humanism in modernity. Okay, so um, Deus Ex Machina is actually an unsuccessful tragedy device, right? It's something that Aristotle himself criticizes in the Poetics. So we don't want something that's a Deus Ex Machina, which is just a god dropped down from on high to the stage to resolve some irresolvable problem. But the limits of humanism, yeah, I mean, Lovecraft is definitely somebody who thinks that human beings are not the central show in reality as we encounter it. And when you look at the Cthulhu mythos, right, you got this vast, billions of years kind of panorama and all sorts of great old ones. You got a blind and stupid Azazoth at the center of the universe piping away. Well, actually, he's just churning away. I think, if I remember right, there's pipers around him. We're like nothing compared to these things. There've been other races here in the world Earth as we know it, and they've died, or maybe didn't completely die. The Shoggoths are still there, in Antarctica, waiting to be rediscovered. So, I mean, that's definitely part of Lovecraft's point of view, isn't it? And it's interesting because we talked about Poe, Lovecraft, Stephen King. Somebody else who's clearly very influenced by Lovecraft and has taken some of these ideas further is Thomas Ligotti, right? Who is a current, well, so is King, currently living horror author, very imaginative, but who's written about this sort of stuff in a nonfiction book, Conspiracy Against the Human Race, which we covered in the Worlds of Speculative Fiction series just a few months ago. Bruno says, I really enjoy the quote in The Tomb. The learned man knows there's no clear distinction between the real and the unreal. Yeah, I mean, there is science, right, for Lovecraft. So we can carry out scientific work, and you could say, well, the things that we study in science, those are real, right? Or at least the measurements we take of them are real. But most of the human beings in Lovecraft's universe are not scientists. They're ordinary folk, and some of them are involved in cults to bring about the great old ones. Now, not so much in these fantasy stories, but with Lovecraft and the larger horror stuff. And there's also, and this is something that Lovecraft thought about a lot and talked with his fellow writers quite a bit, this poetic production of stories, of narratives, of characters, of insights. And Lovecraft in supernatural horror and literature actually says it's not really so much about what we would call the level of the content, it's the atmosphere that you produce. And this is one way that we can distinguish these stories, the ones that we just looked at. These they're often called Dunsanian because he's under the influence of Lord Dunsay. These fantasy stories from the stories of cosmic horror, although the Other Gods is kind of leaning into that. It's a different atmosphere that is being generated in them, and I would even say maybe there's different sub-atmospheres created across Lovecraft's horror stories as well, so that the thing on the doorstep is not quite the same atmosphere as the Call of Cthulhu, or Mountains of Madness, or Dunwich Horror, stuff like that, right? So Matt Gilbert says, I appreciate the way Lovecraft explores deep time in his work. So yeah, deep time, this is kind of a recently articulated concept, but I guess the idea has been around for quite a while. And this is part of what made a lot of people in modernity who are more traditional want to reject things like fossils, evolution, all these sorts of things about the scientific view of the world. We human beings and our cultures especially have been around for just like a tiny little part of the timeline, right? And it's really interesting when you think of this. I sprung this on one of my classes just the other day. Part of Earth's history, right, included a time when you couldn't even have fire. You could have hot stuff, the core was molten, still is, thank God, because otherwise we'd be screwed. You could have volcanoes, you could have all sorts of things, but you couldn't actually have fire until you had enough oxygen in the atmosphere to have that. And that required that there be plants and other, organisms taking in carbon dioxide, producing oxygen as a waste product. Until you had that, you couldn't even really have this thing that our ancestors years and years back, and culture after culture after culture, have taken not just as a reality of their lives, but as a primal element of the existence of things. So, you know, part of the promise of deep time in Lovecraft's works is that um, we don't even really understand the chronology of things. You know, it just goes way, way back. And Lovecraft, uses language to try to convey this. He loves the word eons. You know, he loves talking about these incredibly old cyclopean cities or ruins or things like that we could participate in. And again, you're getting kind of a hint of that in this story, The Other Gods, I would say. All right, who framed the Socratic method? I like the irony of From Beyond being both body horror and cosmic horror, with a line about philosophy and science potentially destroying reason. Lovecraft had wit and irony like Poe and Wilde. So Oscar Wilde, yeah. And the Lovecraftian view on things, I'm not going to say it's derived from Nietzsche, but Nietzsche in his works, from the birth of tragedy onward, this is one of the central themes of his works that, hey, it's so cool we have modern science, but modern science in revealing to us the world both undercuts, older traditional ways of understanding things and even comes to undercut itself. And this is the problem of nihilism that gets raised as what he calls the problem of the coming century. He lives to see in an insane asylum and then dies shortly afterwards, the new century, the 1900s, that we're no longer in. And Nietzsche thinks that the development and spread of the sciences plays a a central role in that. And so, like, destroying reason, destroying rationalism, destroying our faith in human reason. And you can say, well, how the hell does something that is coming from reason going to do that? Well, this is one of the paradoxes that Nietzsche and Lovecraft and other people are bringing out. And I would even say, going back to Edgar Allan Poe, you read that story, The Imp of the Perverse, right? And there, so we're talking now the early 1800s. That's a very interesting essay, isn't it? All right, Quinn says, my schooling is in archaeology primarily. I love the combination between material history and philosophical practice. Not too relevant, but reminded me of deep time discussion around fire tech. Yeah, to take this into a different direction, I often tell my students, when we start a philosophy class, you have been doing philosophy your whole life. You've just been doing it without realizing it was called that. And you've probably done it in slipshod ways, and you might still be doing that later on. And there's plenty of people out there doing philosophy with a capital P who are doing so in kind of slipshod, dogmatic ways as well. But you can't, you as much as you try to like confine your point of view to, I'm just going to do science, you can't. Science is inextricably connected up with philosophy. There's no way around it. And so now the part of the problem is, okay, so then, well, I better study philosophy. Well, there's so much damn stuff out there that you're never going to be able to study all of it. And the more time that you do explicitly study philosophy, the less time you have for doing your actual day job, and vice versa, right? So we're always kind of cobbling together stuff on the fly. Um, so Matt has another question. Do we know which, if any, philosophers influenced Lovecraft? I'm aware of an essay he wrote about nihilism, and I think his atheism. Yeah, and he's not an atheist in the way like the new atheists are. As a matter of fact, there are gods in Lovecraft stories. They're just not the kind of god that we're used to thinking of, right? And I don't know if we want them to be gods or not. I mean, Lovecraft is So let's back this up again. So Lovecraft is influenced by Poe, right? Many other authors as well. And a lot of those authors themselves are, in effect, engaging with philosophy and natural science in their works. Poe is conscious of quite a few people. And Lovecraft is, living, he's not living in Boston, right? But you could say that he's in a Bostonian, New Yorkian, Providence orbit as far as like learned literature and stuff like that. So, he's familiar with people who are very popular at the time, like Herbert Spencer, right? The great utilitarian and positivist philosopher that really nobody reads anymore, but was kind of a big deal back then. He knows Nietzsche. He knows a number of other interesting philosophers as well. He knows about, it's sort of in basic terms, like the history of ideas. He's not doing philosophy to do philosophy. He's not like saying, "Ooh, I want to take these ideas from this thinker and allegorize them into a story." He's sort of like Philip K. Dick in that respect, right? Who's read quite a lot, and he hasn't just read philosophy as such as a isolated discipline. He's read, some religion stuff and some literature, some poetry. I mean, Lovecraft is very into poetry, as was Poe, as were a lot of people back then. And Lovecraft also learns things from talking with other people. So one of his big correspondents was Robert Howard, right? And we can talk about the influence of some of these other thinkers on Howard as well, too, right? But Lovecraft had like an incredible network of people that he was writing to. And who were writing to him. So, yeah. Who framed the Socratic method? Lovecraft loved detective fiction. I see a lot of influence from Victorian times like Doyle, but more importantly, Poe's rationalization. I wonder about Wilde's satire of supernatural detective fiction. Yeah, I don't know if Wilde had a big influence on Lovecraft that way. And he's he does have some of the tropes, we could say, of detective fiction, right? But it's within a horror framework. So, think about Call of Cthulhu, right? We have, in effect, a detective story going on. What's with these weird cults? What's going on here? But it leads you to this gigantic being who awakens from the lost city of Relay underneath the water. So it's not your normal detective fiction. Oh, we found the perpetrators. We're gonna take them away to prison, or they hung themselves or something like that. It is detective fiction. And actually, somebody else who plays with this trope, who's a follower of Lovecraft, August Derleth, right? He actually, Derleth is interesting because he actually has a detective fiction series that was so similar to Sherlock Holmes that Arthur Conan Doyle's estate sued Derleth and lost his Solar Ponds stuff. But he also does have, Cthulhu mythos stuff, and he monkeys around with the mythos. He's doing something a bit different, but he's also really important for keeping Lovecraft's works and ideas alive. And in his admittedly second-rate writings compared to Lovecraft's originals, he has detectives as well. And you notice, if any of you have ever played the Chaosium game, Call of Cthulhu, detective is one of the character types that you can play in that because it figures into that. All right. Matthew's played that. I've never actually gotten to play it. I've only gotten to, as you often do with RPGs, look through the rules and catalog and stuff like that. Matt says, I'd like to acknowledge H.P. Lovecraft's influence on metal music. Yeah, that's significant. He has furnished great themes for musicians to explore. You could think of the very song, a great instrumental by Metallica, the Call of Cthulhu. which is just a wonderful long song. I used to play that when I played bass. I had the songbooks for the first 3 albums, and as well as Iron Maiden stuff and Black Sabbath stuff and things like that. And that was one of my favorite songs to play. I'd get my distortion pedal out because it was just me, and then I'd play it and stuff like that. Oh, Matthew asks, which is your favorite story? I don't know if you already said it. I don't have a favorite H.P. Lovecraft story. I would say I have like among my favorites, right? And the Cats of Ulthar is one of them. That's why I did it for this presentation. I mean, I do like the Dream Quest of Unknown Cadath, which is also in this thing. Yeah, of the others, I mean, the Dunwich Horror, I would say, is a particularly gripping one. Um, I forget the name of the one, but it's the one where Nyarlathotep actually comes to uh, the society, right? Um, Henry asked, "Do you have a favorite film that's inspired by Lovecraft?" I haven't seen The Color Out of Space, and I hear that's pretty good. Um, I have seen the Dunwich Horror, which was done in the 70s. Terrible. You know, I actually saw that back in the late 80s. Um, uh, the one that had Sam Neill in it, and I'm blanking on the name, was pretty good. Because part of what I'm looking for in these stories is, like Lovecraft said, atmosphere is really important. And I also want to see if you're doing stuff, you don't just bring the Necronomicon in like Evil Dead has. Oh, it's a scary book, bad book, or something like that. There's got to be this sense of horror. I would say, it's not inspired by Lovecraft, but one of the scariest horror movies that I've ever seen is Prince of Darkness. That is really, really creepy. Event Horizon. In the Mouth of Madness, the Sam Neill one. That's quite good. Event Horizon is pretty damn creepy too, in the same kind of way. I think you gotta leave the motivations of the evil, powerful being somewhat in the background, so that you're not quite sure what the hell's going on or what's going to stop them, right? So that figures in. And I think you could say, and somebody mentioned body horror, The Thing is not based on a Lovecraft story. It's based on another story that is in the Science Fiction Hall of Fame called Who Goes There? And it's a really great story. And The Thing is pretty faithful to it, but The Thing could be viewed also as Lovecraftian as well, right? Somebody did Pickman's Model recently. That is interesting. Yeah, that could be a good one. This is a whole big conversation we could have, and I'm actually going to have to get going because we're going to watch the game in just a bit. Go back to mundane reality. It's tough to adapt certain kinds of speculative fiction literature well to film or TV. And part of that is just, getting across the atmosphere correctly, adequately. Part of it is like getting the writers and the producers to stick to the damn story, because they always want to like put their own spin on it. And usually they make it bad when they do that, right? They reduce it. It's tough to do those sorts of things well. You really need somebody who appreciates the work. And then there's certain things that are just tough to do. I talked about this recently with Jimmy Nuts. We had a conversation about Philip K. Dick's Man in the High Castle and the use of the Oracle, or I Ching, right? The Book of Changes. And we're like, well, how would you actually, it's really absolutely important in the book, but how do you get that across in a cinematic way that people would appreciate? what they would end up doing, Hollywood producers, is like having the Euro stocks glow and float in the air, and then the book opens up, it like flips open. But you don't want to do all that kind of bullshit. You want it, a great movie, in my view, that I haven't seen for a long time, but it made a huge impression on me when I did see it, that was able to get across like the sense of threat and dread without doing a hell of a lot, and making things go pretty slow, was Tarkovsky's The Stalker, Not Lovecraftian, but really getting that atmospheric thing across. So, um, so Matt says Guillermo del Toro had Pickman's model in his cabinet of curiosities. I'll have to check that out. That sounds quite interesting. So, all right. Well, this is a good place to wrap it up. I didn't expect it to actually go this long, but we had some great discussion. So thanks to everybody for your comments. If you haven't read these stories, you can find the links below to free versions of them. They're very quick, very easy to get through. You should check them out. Not horror stories as such, but you can definitely get some enjoyment out of them. And I will see you all next month. Not sure which story I'll be doing for next month, but I'm going to start resuming these Sadler telling stories. And so I hope all of you have a great evening, morning, afternoon, wherever you happen to be. And I'll see you next time.